The fluorescent lights in Conference Room B cast an unforgiving glare across the polished table where my career was about to be dissected. David Morrison's perfectly pressed suit and calculated smile told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. The manila folder in front of him contained what I already suspected was my termination paperwork, positioned just so I could see the TechFlow Industries letterhead from across the table. "Sarah, let's cut to the chase," Morrison said, his tone carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd clearly practiced this conversation. "Your approach to innovation is frankly outdated for where this company needs to go. Anyone can be replaced, and honestly, your methods are holding us back from the agility we need in today's market." The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. 12 years of developing groundbreaking automation systems. For TechFlow Industries, 3 major patents that had generated millions in revenue, and countless late nights perfecting the SmartFlow system that could revolutionize manufacturing efficiency. All of it reduced to replaceable by a man who'd been with the company for exactly 8 months. I glanced at Lisa Thompson, our HR director, who sat rigidly beside Morrison with her laptop open, fingers poised over keys like a court stenographer preparing to document an execution. She wouldn't meet my eyes, which confirmed what I'd begun to suspect over the past few weeks. This wasn't a performance review. This was a predetermined outcome. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 6th floor executive conference room had always felt intimidating. With its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Austin's sprawling tech corridor, but today it felt like a tribunal. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass, creating harsh shadows across Morrison's face as he continued speaking with rehearsed precision. "The technology landscape moves fast, Sarah. What worked 5 years ago doesn't necessarily serve us now. We need fresh perspectives, innovative thinking that aligns with current market demands." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like an indictment. "Your incremental improvements and perfectionist tendencies are luxuries we can't afford anymore." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Incremental improvements? The SmartFlow system I'd been developing represented a complete paradigm shift in industrial automation. The AI-driven predictive maintenance algorithms alone could save manufacturers hundreds of thousands of dollars annually while reducing environmental waste by 40%. But Morrison had never bothered to understand the technical details, viewing the R&D department as an expensive line item rather than the innovation engine that had built TechFlow's reputation. "I've dedicated 12 years to this company," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The automation systems I've developed are currently generating 68% of our revenue. The SmartFlow project has the potential to transform our entire market position." Morrison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Past performance doesn't guarantee future relevance, Sarah. The board has made it clear that we need to streamline operations and eliminate redundancies. Your position is being restructured as part of our strategic realignment." Strategic realignment, corporate speak for cutting costs without admitting to cutting corners. I'd watched Morrison systematically dismantle everything that had made TechFlow successful, starting with slashing the R&D budget by 40% 3 months ago. Projects that had been 3 years in development were suddenly deemed non-essential. Engineers with decades of experience were encouraged to pursue opportunities elsewhere. "What happens to the SmartFlow patents?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The 3 patent applications I'd filed over the past 18 months represented not just my intellectual property, but potentially the most valuable assets TechFlow owned. "All company-developed intellectual property remains with TechFlow naturally," Morrison replied smoothly. "We'll be transitioning oversight of those projects to more, shall we say, market-responsive leadership." The casual theft of my life's work was delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. I thought about the countless nights I'd spent in the lab, the breakthrough moments when complex problems finally yielded to innovative solutions, the careful documentation I'd maintained of every development phase, all of it about to be handed over to someone who'd had no part in its creation. Lisa finally spoke, her voice carefully modulated to sound both professional and sympathetic. "Sarah, we've prepared a comprehensive separation package that we believe fairly reflects your contributions to the company. The terms include 6 months of salary continuation and extended healthcare coverage." She slid a bound document across the table, its pages thick with legal terminology designed to overwhelm and intimidate. I didn't need to read every clause to understand the basic framework. Sign away my rights to challenge the termination or discuss company matters publicly in exchange for a financial cushion that would buy me time to find new employment. What caught my attention was the timing. Not just the fact that I was being terminated, but when. My stock options, earned through years of 60-hour weeks and successful product launches, were scheduled to vest in exactly 2 weeks. Options, currently valued at nearly $300,000 based on TechFlow's recent stock performance. The coincidence was so glaring it felt almost insulting. "You're eliminating my position 2 weeks before my stock options vest," I observed, keeping my tone neutral despite the anger building in my chest. Morrison's expression flickered with irritation at having the subtext stated so directly. "The timing of our organizational decisions is based on market conditions and operational efficiency. Your options package reflects the standard contractual terms you agreed to when you joined TechFlow." Standard contractual terms that had been modified twice during my tenure, most recently when I'd declined a lucrative offer from our biggest competitor 2 years ago. The retention agreement had included additional stock options specifically to keep me at TechFlow, personally negotiated by our previous CEO, who'd understood that innovation required long-term thinking and investment. In key personnel, I glanced around the room that had hosted some of the most important product development meetings in TechFlow's history. The whiteboard still bore faint traces of equations from our last SmartFlow review session, mathematical formulas that represented months of research and development. In 3 hours, I'd gone from leading the company's most promising innovation project to being escorted out as obsolete overhead. "I'll need time to review the separation agreement," I said, closing the document without examining it further. The legal language would require careful analysis, particularly any clauses related to intellectual property and non-disclosure requirements. "Of course," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he expected immediate compliance. "We'll need your decision by Friday. Given the sensitive nature of your work, we've arranged for your personal items to be collected and delivered to your home address this evening. Your system access has been suspended as of 30 minutes ago." The clinical efficiency of the process revealed how long this decision had been in motion. My company laptop had probably received a remote wipe command during our meeting, erasing years of research notes and development files. Not that it mattered much. I'd learned long ago to maintain personal backups of my work, a habit developed during graduate school that had served me well throughout my career. Lisa stood, indicating that our meeting was concluded. "James will escort you to the main lobby. We appreciate your professionalism during this transition, Sarah." James turned out to be a young security guard I'd never seen before, probably hired specifically to handle the recent wave of restructuring that had swept through TechFlow's experienced workforce. He maintained an uncomfortable professional distance as we walked through the 4th floor R&D department, past labs where I'd spent countless hours developing the technologies that had made TechFlow successful. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being walked out of a building I'd helped design during our expansion 5 years earlier. I'd advocated for the open lab spaces that encouraged collaboration, the specialized testing equipment that enabled rapid prototyping, the secure server room that housed our most valuable intellectual property. Now I was being escorted past it all like a potential security threat. My former team was conspicuously absent from their workstations, likely called to an emergency meeting to ensure I wouldn't encounter them during my exit. The thought of not being able to say goodbye to colleagues who'd become friends over the years added a personal sting to the professional devastation. The elevator ride to the lobby was silent, except for the mechanical hum of the building's systems, automation technology that ironically relied on principles I'd helped develop. When we reached the ground floor, James gestured toward the main entrance with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Chen. Have a good afternoon." I walked through the lobby that had once felt like a second home, past the wall displaying TechFlow's patents and innovations, including 3 that bore my name as primary inventor. The glass doors that had welcomed me each morning for 12 years now felt like a barrier to a world where my expertise was no longer valued. Outside, the Texas heat hit me immediately, the late afternoon sun reflecting off the concrete and glass of Austin's tech district. The ordinary rhythm of traffic and pedestrians continued undisturbed, the world carrying on normally while my professional life had just been systematically dismantled. I checked my personal phone, noting several missed calls from colleagues who'd probably heard rumors about the restructuring. Rather than immediately returning calls or summoning a rideshare, I decided to walk the 16 blocks to my downtown apartment. The physical movement would help process what had just happened and what needed to happen next. Because while David Morrison believed he'd just eliminated an expensive redundancy, what he'd actually done was create something far more dangerous to his plans. An experienced engineer with comprehensive knowledge of TechFlow's most valuable, intellectual property, someone who'd maintained detailed records of every development decision and innovation breakthrough, someone who understood exactly how the patent process worked and what constituted legitimate intellectual property theft. I wasn't just Sarah Chen, recently terminated senior research engineer. I was the documented inventor of technologies worth millions of dollars, and I'd just been freed from all corporate constraints on protecting my intellectual property rights. The separation agreement sitting in my bag might offer short-term financial security, but signing it would mean abandoning not just my own work, but the principle that innovation deserved proper attribution and protection. By the time I reached my apartment building, the initial shock had crystallized into something much more focused. I greeted Carlos, the building's evening doorman, with my usual smile despite arriving hours earlier than normal. "Everything okay, Ms. Chen? You're home early for once." "Just a change in schedule, Carlos. I might be working from home for a while." "About time they gave you some flexibility," he replied warmly. "You work too hard anyway." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If only he knew that my work schedule had just been permanently and involuntarily adjusted. In my apartment, I immediately went to my home office, a space I'd carefully organized for the occasional weekend project or late-night patent research. I powered on my personal laptop and created a secure document to record every detail of the termination meeting while the conversation remained fresh in my memory. Not necessarily for litigation purposes, though that remained a possibility, but because thorough documentation had always been my professional methodology. Complex technical problems required capturing details that might initially seem unimportant, but later prove crucial for understanding system failures or identifying solutions. As I finished documenting the meeting, my doorbell rang. The courier had arrived with my personal effects. 12 years of professional life reduced to 3 cardboard boxes. I signed for the delivery and carried the boxes to my dining table, carefully unpacking each item with the same methodical approach I applied to technical analysis. The packing had been hasty and impersonal, clearly done by someone unfamiliar with the significance of various items. Technical manuals were jumbled together with personal photographs, awards stacked carelessly against coffee mugs, my engineering notebooks mixed with spare office supplies. Among the items was a framed photograph from TechFlow's 10th anniversary celebration, showing me standing beside Dr. Elizabeth Warren, our founder and former CEO. both of us smiling as we unveiled the company's expanded research facilities. Elizabeth's expression captured the genuine enthusiasm for innovation that had originally attracted me to TechFlow, a stark contrast to Morrison's purely financial perspective on technology development. At the bottom of the third box, I found my personal engineering notebooks, 5 years of handwritten observations from research sessions, product meetings, and technical conferences. While all official documentation remained on TechFlow's servers, these personal notes contained my unfiltered thoughts, concerns that had been raised but not addressed, and the creative process behind breakthrough innovations that no official report could capture. These notebooks had been constant companions throughout my career at TechFlow, present at every significant technical discussion. Their contents weren't confidential company documents, but rather my personal professional journal, protected by the same intellectual property principles that governed individual research and creative development. I arranged the notebooks chronologically on my desk and sat back, considering my options carefully. The separation agreement offered 6 months of financial security, but would require comprehensive non-disclosure commitments that could prevent me from protecting my intellectual property rights. More importantly, it included clauses that would legally restrict my ability to challenge any patent applications that might misrepresent the true inventors of TechFlow's technologies. My phone chimed with a text message from Kevin Park, the junior engineer who'd joined my team 6 months ago straight from the University of Texas. Kevin had quickly proven himself brilliant with automation programming, but still relied heavily on my guidance for understanding the broader system architectures that made individual components function effectively. Just heard about today. This makes no sense at all. Can we talk? I considered my response carefully. Kevin wasn't part of the executive decision-making that had led to my termination, but he was young and idealistic, probably struggling to understand how a company could discard proven expertise for short-term cost savings. He was also still employed by TechFlow, which meant any communication with me could potentially jeopardize his position if discovered. Not through company channels, I texted back. Personal email only if you want to discuss anything. I then disabled notifications on my phone and focused on what required immediate attention. The separation agreement demanded my signature by Friday, giving me exactly 4 days to fully assess the situation and determine my response. 4 days to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened with such calculated precision. Because while Morrison and the new executive team saw me as an expensive legacy resource with outdated approaches, what they'd failed to understand was that my value wasn't in coding algorithms or designing circuit boards. My value was in the comprehensive understanding of complex interconnected systems, both technological and legal, that could only be developed through years of focused innovation and careful documentation. They'd dismissed me as replaceable, but as I reviewed my notebooks and considered the timing of recent decisions, a troubling pattern began to emerge. One that suggested my termination wasn't primarily about cost reduction or organizational efficiency. The real issue was that I knew too much about the development history of TechFlow's most valuable assets, observed too carefully how intellectual property was being managed, and most dangerously, had the technical credibility and legal standing to raise questions about patent ownership that others couldn't effectively challenge. As evening settled over Austin, I organized my notes chronologically and began reconstructing the events of the past 8 months since Morrison's appointment as CEO. The personnel changes, the shifted research priorities, the accelerated timelines for patent filings, the systematic removal of senior engineers who'd been involved in major innovations. Each decision individually seemed like typical corporate evolution under new leadership. Collectively, they suggested something far more concerning. By midnight, I'd constructed a detailed timeline that confirmed my growing suspicions. This wasn't just about eliminating my salary or avoiding stock option obligations. This was about removing the primary obstacle to a fundamentally flawed intellectual property strategy that prioritized rapid monetization over proper inventor attribution. a strategy that could potentially invalidate patents worth millions of dollars if the true development history ever came to light. The question was no longer whether I should challenge this termination, but how to do so in a way that protected not just my own intellectual property rights, but the integrity of the innovation process that had made TechFlow successful. Morrison might believe that anyone could be replaced, but some knowledge, some expertise, and some principles were genuinely irreplaceable. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an email from an address I hadn't seen in over a year. Margaret Rodriguez, TechFlow's former chief technology officer who'd retired 18 months ago after building the company's R&D department from scratch. The subject line read simply, "We should talk. Something's not right." Perhaps I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the troubling pattern of decisions that prioritized short-term extraction over long-term innovation. Perhaps being called replaceable by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the value of expertise wasn't the professional death sentence Morrison intended it to be. I smiled for the first time since the termination meeting. Friday's deadline suddenly seemed less like a threat and more like an opportunity. Because while David Morrison believed he'd just solved a cost problem by removing an outdated engineer, what he'd actually done was activate someone with detailed knowledge of TechFlow's most valuable intellectual property and comprehensive documentation of exactly how that property had been developed. Someone who understood that in the world of patents and intellectual property, the truth always mattered more than corporate convenience. And someone who was about to discover that being called replaceable was the biggest mistake Morrison could have made. Sleep came in fragments that night, my mind cycling through 12 years of memories that suddenly felt like evidence rather than nostalgia. I woke at dawn with unusual clarity, the kind of mental sharpness that typically emerged after solving a particularly complex engineering problem. The difference was that this time, the problem was my own professional life, and the solution required understanding systems far more complicated than automation protocols. I made coffee in the pre-dawn quiet of my apartment, watching the city slowly illuminate through my kitchen window. Austin's tech corridor stretched out below, glass towers reflecting the early morning light, housing thousands of engineers and innovators who trusted that their work would be properly valued and attributed. The naivety of that assumption had never been clearer to me than it was in this moment. My phone displayed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, colleagues and friends who'd heard about TechFlow's latest round of restructuring. Word traveled fast in Austin's interconnected tech community, particularly when it involved senior engineers with established reputations. I scrolled through the messages, noting the genuine concern and bewilderment from people who understood exactly what TechFlow was losing by discarding proven expertise. One message stood out from the others, sent by Dr. Amanda Foster, a former colleague who'd left TechFlow 2 years ago to start her own automation consulting firm. "Sarah, just heard the news. This is insane. David Morrison is systematically destroying everything that made TechFlow successful. Call me when you can." Amanda's observation aligned with what I'd been documenting in my timeline. Morrison wasn't just cutting costs. He was methodically dismantling the institutional knowledge and innovative capacity that had built TechFlow's reputation. The question was whether this represented incompetent leadership or something more calculated. I opened my laptop and reviewed the separation agreement Morrison had provided, reading each clause with the detailed attention I typically reserved for patent applications. The legal language was deliberately complex, designed to overwhelm rather than inform, but the essential terms were clear enough. 6 months of salary and healthcare coverage in exchange for comprehensive silence about my employment experience and any company-related matters. Most concerning was Section 12, which required me to acknowledge that all work performed during my employment belonged exclusively to TechFlow Industries, with no individual claims to intellectual property or innovation recognition. The clause went further, requiring me to assist TechFlow in defending any intellectual property challenges and to refrain from any actions that might undermine the company's patent portfolio. The language was so broad it would effectively prevent me from ever discussing my own innovations, even in job interviews or professional conferences. Signing this agreement wouldn't just end my employment at TechFlow, it would erase my professional identity as an inventor and engineer. I closed the laptop and reached for my engineering notebooks, spreading them across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle that needed reassembling. The earliest entries dated back to my third year at TechFlow, when I'd first begun developing the foundational concepts that would eventually become the SmartFlow system. Page after page of handwritten calculations, sketched diagrams, and creative breakthroughs that had emerged from late-night research sessions. These notebooks contained something that no corporate agreement could eliminate: the documented creative process of innovation. Every major breakthrough was recorded with timestamps, environmental conditions, even my emotional state during particularly productive sessions. The intellectual journey from initial concept to working prototype was mapped in meticulous detail, creating an unalterable record of how complex technologies had actually been developed. I found the entry from 3 years ago, when the core SmartFlow concept had first crystallized. I'd been working on a routine maintenance optimization problem when I realized that the real innovation wasn't in predicting when machines would fail, but in creating systems that learned and adapted to prevent failures altogether. The breakthrough had occurred at 2:30 in the morning in my home office, fueled by frustration with traditional approaches and strong coffee. The notebooks documented not just what I'd invented, but how and when I'd invented it. Corporate lawyers could argue about employment contracts and intellectual property assignments, but they couldn't alter the historical record of creative development that existed in my personal documentation. My doorbell rang at 8:15, earlier than any delivery service typically operated. I checked the security monitor and was surprised to see Margaret Rodriguez standing in my building's lobby, holding a paper coffee cup and looking remarkably alert for someone who'd supposedly retired from the demanding world of technology leadership. Margaret had been my mentor during my early years at TechFlow, teaching me not just technical skills, but the broader strategic thinking that separated good engineers from transformational innovators. Her unexpected visit suggested she'd been monitoring the situation more closely than her retirement status might imply. I buzzed her up and met her at the elevator, noting that she looked healthier and more relaxed than she had during her final stressful years managing TechFlow's increasingly complex research portfolio. Retirement clearly agreed with her, though. The sharp intelligence in her eyes remained unchanged. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind the early visit, but I needed to speak with you before your situation gets more complicated than it already is." She handed me the extra coffee cup she'd been carrying. "We need to talk about what's really happening at TechFlow." We settled in my living room, Margaret taking in the view of the tech corridor with the practiced eye of someone who'd helped build much of what we could see. She'd been instrumental in convincing several major technology companies to establish operations in Austin, creating the ecosystem that had made the city a legitimate competitor to Silicon Valley. "Margaret, I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you. When you retired, you seemed ready to disconnect from corporate technology completely." She smiled, but there was something serious behind her expression. Retirement gave me perspective on what I'd helped build at TechFlow, and more importantly, what could be lost if it falls into the wrong hands. David Morrison represents everything I spent 20 years trying to prevent in technology leadership. Margaret explained that she'd been quietly monitoring TechFlow's direction since Morrison's appointment, maintaining relationships with several board members who shared her concerns about the company's strategic direction. What she'd discovered was more troubling than simple cost-cutting or organizational restructuring. Morrison isn't just reducing expenses, Sarah. He's systematically positioning TechFlow for acquisition by stripping away anything that might complicate a sale. That includes removing senior engineers who might have legitimate claims to intellectual property or who understand the real development history of key innovations. The acquisition angle provided a framework that made Morrison's actions far more logical. If TechFlow was being prepared for sale, eliminating potential complications around patent ownership and inventor attribution would significantly streamline the transaction. Buyers preferred clean intellectual property portfolios without messy questions about individual contributions or employment disputes. "Who's the potential buyer?" I asked, though I suspected Margaret's intelligence network would have identified likely candidates. Meridian Technologies has been circling TechFlow for 18 months, ever since our Q3 earnings exceeded analyst expectations. They specialize in acquiring mid-size automation companies, consolidating their intellectual property, and then licensing the combined portfolio to major manufacturers. Meridian's business model explained the urgency around patent filings and the systematic removal of original inventors. They weren't interested in TechFlow's operational capabilities or innovative culture. They wanted a clean collection of valuable patents that could be monetized without ongoing obligations to the people who'd created them. "Margaret, do you think Morrison is deliberately trying to steal credit for innovations he didn't develop?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think Morrison sees intellectual property as a corporate asset rather than individual achievement. From his perspective, anything developed by TechFlow employees belongs entirely to the company, regardless of who actually did the creative work. The problem is that patent law doesn't always agree with that interpretation." Margaret's legal insight was particularly valuable because she'd been involved in numerous patent disputes during her tenure as CTO. She understood that while employment contracts typically assigned patent rights to employers, the actual inventors retained certain protections and recognition requirements under federal intellectual property law. "The patents you filed for the SmartFlow system list you as the primary inventor, correct?" "Yes. All 3 applications identify me as the primary inventor, with Kevin Park as a contributing inventor for the software integration components. The applications were filed through TechFlow's legal department, but the inventor designations were based on actual technical contributions." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what patent law requires, and it's also what makes Morrison's strategy potentially problematic. If he's planning to reassign patent ownership or change inventor designations, he needs specific legal justification. Simply terminating your employment doesn't automatically transfer your inventor status to someone else." This was the crucial information I'd been missing. My termination might have ended my employment relationship with TechFlow, but it hadn't. Eliminated my legal status as the documented inventor of specific technologies. Morrison could control the patents as corporate assets, but he couldn't erase my role in their creation without violating federal intellectual property requirements. "What do you think I should do about the separation agreement?" Margaret's expression grew more serious. "Before you sign anything, you need to understand exactly what rights you'd be giving up and whether TechFlow is asking you to waive protections that you're legally entitled to maintain. The language in Section 12 is particularly concerning because it's so broad it might not be enforceable." She suggested I consult with a specialist in intellectual property law before making any decisions about the separation agreement. More importantly, she recommended documenting any concerns about patent misrepresentation before signing any agreements that might limit my ability to address such issues later. "Sarah, I'm going to give you contact information for someone who specializes in exactly these kinds of disputes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh is a patent attorney who represents inventors in cases involving employment disputes and intellectual property rights. She understands both the technical and legal aspects of innovation protection." Margaret wrote Dr. Walsh's information on a business card, explaining that Jennifer had previously worked as an electrical engineer before transitioning to patent law. Her technical background made her particularly effective in cases involving complex automation technologies where legal arguments required deep understanding of the underlying engineering principles. Jennifer has represented several inventors in disputes with their former employers over patent attribution and inventor rights. She's also worked with the Patent Office on cases involving questionable filing practices by corporations attempting to obscure the true development history of innovations. The mention of patent office involvement intrigued me. I'd assumed that patent disputes were primarily civil matters handled through standard litigation, but Margaret suggested that federal authorities took intellectual property fraud seriously, particularly when it involved systematic attempts to misrepresent inventor contributions. What kind of authority does the patent office have in these situations? More than most people realize, patent examiners have specific obligations to ensure that applications accurately represent the true inventors and development circumstances. If they receive credible information suggesting that applications contain false or misleading information, they can initiate formal investigations with significant consequences for the companies involved. Margaret explained that patent fraud investigations could result in invalidation of affected patents, financial penalties, and enhanced scrutiny of future applications from the companies involved. For a business like Meridian Technologies that depended on acquiring clean intellectual property portfolios, any questions about TechFlow's patent validity could significantly complicate or derail an acquisition. The leverage you have, Sarah, isn't just about your individual rights as an inventor. It's about the integrity of TechFlow's entire patent portfolio. If Morrison is systematically misrepresenting inventor contributions, that creates legal vulnerabilities that extend far beyond your specific situation. This perspective transformed my understanding of the broader implications. My termination and the problematic separation agreement weren't just personal affronts. They were components of a potentially fraudulent strategy to manipulate intellectual property ownership in preparation for corporate sale. Margaret and I spent the next hour reviewing the timeline I'd constructed, with her providing context about board decisions and strategic discussions that hadn't been visible to me as a senior engineer. The pattern that emerged was even more concerning than I'd initially suspected. Morrison had been systematically removing not just senior engineers, but specifically those who'd been primary inventors on valuable patents. Dr. Robert Chen, who'd developed TechFlow's foundational sensor integration technology, had been encouraged to retire early 6 months ago. Lisa Park, the architect of our machine learning algorithms, had been transferred to a subsidiary role that eliminated her access to ongoing research and development. It's not just cost reduction, Sarah. It's intellectual property consolidation, designed to simplify patent ownership for potential acquirers. Morrison wants to present Meridian with a portfolio where the company can claim comprehensive ownership without worrying about individual inventor rights or employment obligations. Margaret's analysis provided the framework I needed to understand Morrison's broader strategy. The separation agreement wasn't just intended to silence me about my termination. It was designed to eliminate any future challenges to TechFlow's patent ownership claims by securing comprehensive waivers from the actual inventors. What happens if I don't sign the separation agreement? That depends on what you want to achieve. If your goal is simply to protect your own inventor rights and receive appropriate recognition for your innovations, Jennifer Walsh can help you navigate that process without necessarily confronting TechFlow directly. But if you believe Morrison is engaging in systematic intellectual property fraud, that's a different conversation with potentially broader implications. Margaret's distinction was important. I could pursue individual relief focused on my specific patent rights, or I could challenge what appeared to be a systematic attempt to manipulate intellectual property ownership across TechFlow's entire innovation portfolio. The latter approach carried greater risks, but also greater potential impact on preventing similar situations for other inventors. I need to think about this carefully, Margaret. The implications extend beyond my personal situation, but I also need to consider the practical realities of challenging a corporation with significantly more legal resources than I have. Margaret nodded understandingly. That's exactly the right way to think about it. Jennifer Walsh can help you assess both the legal merits of potential challenges and the practical considerations around resources and likely outcomes. But Sarah, remember that you're not just an individual inventor. You're someone with documented proof of significant innovations and a professional reputation that gives your concerns credibility. As our conversation concluded, Margaret provided one additional piece of information that proved crucial for my decision-making process. She'd learned through her board connections that Morrison was planning to announce major patent portfolio developments at TechFlow's quarterly earnings call in 3 weeks. The timing suggested he intended to present the intellectual property assets as completely owned and controlled by the company, without acknowledging individual inventor contributions or potential complications. If you're going to challenge the patent attribution or raise concerns about intellectual property misrepresentation, you probably want to do so before Morrison makes public statements that could be difficult to retract later. Margaret's strategic insight provided the timeline I needed for making decisions about the separation agreement and potential legal action. 3 weeks to understand my options, gather additional documentation, and determine whether I wanted to pursue individual relief or broader challenges to TechFlow's intellectual property practices. After Margaret left, I called Dr. Jennifer Walsh's office and scheduled a consultation for the following afternoon. The receptionist noted that Dr. Walsh had experience with employment-related patent disputes and would need me to bring comprehensive documentation of my innovations and employment circumstances. I spent the remainder of the day organizing my engineering notebooks and gathering supporting materials that documented my role in developing the SmartFlow system and other TechFlow innovations. The process was both therapeutic and revealing, as I rediscovered creative breakthroughs and problem-solving sessions that had been crucial for major technical advances. One discovery particularly stood out: a series of emails I'd exchanged with Kevin Park during the initial development of the SmartFlow artificial intelligence algorithms. The messages clearly documented my role in developing the core concepts, while showing Kevin's contributions to specific implementation details. The collaborative process was exactly what patent law intended to protect, with clear attribution of individual contributions to collective innovations. As evening approached, I received a text message from Kevin requesting to meet after work hours to discuss concerns about recent developments at TechFlow. His message was carefully worded to avoid specific allegations, but the urgency suggested he'd observed something that troubled him professionally. I agreed to meet at Central Grind, a coffee shop near TechFlow's offices that was popular with local engineers, but far enough from corporate headquarters to provide some privacy for sensitive conversations. Kevin's request to meet outside normal channels suggested he understood that internal communications might be monitored, particularly given the recent focus on organizational security and confidentiality. Central Grind occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Austin's industrial district, its exposed brick walls and minimalist aesthetic attracting freelancers, startup entrepreneurs, and employees from larger companies who needed neutral territory for conversations that couldn't happen in corporate environments. I arrived 15 minutes early to observe the space and ensure we wouldn't be overheard by anyone connected to TechFlow. Kevin arrived precisely on time, looking more stressed than I'd seen him during his 6 months at TechFlow. He'd always been enthusiastic about the technical challenges of automation engineering, but tonight he appeared troubled by something that extended beyond normal workplace pressure. "Sarah, thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure if you'd be willing to discuss TechFlow matters after everything that happened yesterday." "Kevin, my employment relationship with TechFlow has ended, but my interest in protecting the integrity of our technical work hasn't. What's concerning you?" He explained that following my termination, Morrison had called an emergency meeting with the remaining engineering staff to discuss accelerated timelines for completing and filing patent applications related to ongoing research projects. The meeting had focused specifically on the SmartFlow system, with Morrison announcing that he would be taking personal oversight of the patent finalization process. "Sarah, the way Morrison discussed the SmartFlow patents made it sound like the innovations were company-developed technologies rather than specific individual contributions." He kept referring to TechFlow's artificial intelligence capabilities and automation breakthroughs, without mentioning you or even acknowledging that these were your creative developments. Kevin's observation confirmed my concerns about Morrison's strategy for presenting TechFlow's intellectual property portfolio. By characterizing innovations as company-wide capabilities rather than individual achievements, Morrison could simplify patent ownership questions and avoid complications around inventor attribution requirements. Did Morrison mention any specific changes to the patent applications or filing procedures? Kevin hesitated before responding, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what he'd witnessed. He instructed the legal department to expedite all pending applications and to ensure that patent documentation reflected TechFlow's comprehensive ownership of all innovations developed during company time using company resources. The language Kevin quoted was significantly broader than standard employment contract provisions and suggested Morrison was attempting to expand TechFlow's intellectual property claims beyond what federal patent law typically permitted. Innovations. Developed using personal time, personal resources, or building on knowledge acquired before employment generally retained some individual inventor protections, even when filed through corporate patent programs. Kevin, did anyone raise questions about the patent acceleration or documentation changes Morrison announced? Dr. Thompson from the legal department mentioned that changing inventor designations on pending applications would require specific justification and potentially supplemental filings with the patent office. Morrison told her to focus on procedural compliance rather than questioning strategic decisions. Kevin's account suggested that even TechFlow's internal legal counsel had concerns about Morrison's patent strategy, but was being instructed to implement changes without full consideration of their legal appropriateness. This created potential liability for the company if the modifications resulted in inaccurate or misleading patent applications. Sarah, there's something else you should know. Morrison announced that all engineering staff would be required to sign updated confidentiality and intellectual property agreements as a condition of continued employment. The new agreements include much broader non-disclosure provisions and more restrictive post-employment limitations. The timing of additional confidentiality requirements immediately following my termination suggested Morrison was concerned about information leakage regarding his intellectual property strategy, requiring existing employees to sign more restrictive agreements could help prevent other engineers from raising concerns about patent attribution or documentation practices. Kevin explained that the new agreements would be presented to staff next week with a requirement for immediate signature as part of what Morrison described as routine legal compliance updates. Employees who declined to sign would be subject to performance review and potential termination for failing to meet administrative requirements. Kevin, I want you to be very careful about your response to these new agreements. Read them thoroughly, and consider consulting with independent legal counsel before signing anything that might affect your future career options or professional rights. I also advised Kevin to maintain personal documentation of his technical contributions to ongoing projects, particularly the SmartFlow artificial intelligence algorithms he'd helped develop. If Morrison was planning to modify patent applications or inventor designations, Kevin's documented role in specific innovations could provide important protection for his own intellectual property rights. Sarah, do you think Morrison is deliberately trying to steal credit for work he didn't do? I think Morrison is prioritizing corporate control over individual recognition in ways that may not be consistent with federal patent law requirements. The specific motivations matter less than the potential consequences for inventors whose contributions might be minimized or eliminated. Kevin and I discussed the broader implications of Morrison's strategy for TechFlow's engineering culture and innovative capacity. If talented engineers understood that their creative contributions wouldn't receive appropriate recognition or protection, the company would struggle to attract and retain the expertise necessary for continued technological leadership. The irony is that Morrison is undermining the very capabilities that make TechFlow valuable to potential acquirers like Meridian Technologies. Innovation requires trust that individual contributions will be recognized and protected, not systematically appropriated for corporate convenience. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Kevin providing additional details about recent organizational changes and strategic decisions that weren't visible to me as a former employee. The picture that emerged was of a company systematically prioritizing short-term financial considerations over long-term innovative capacity and legal compliance. As we prepared to leave Central Grind, Kevin made a request that surprised me with its professional courage. "Sarah, if you decide to challenge Morrison's patent strategy or raise concerns with external authorities, I want you to know that I'd be willing to provide factual information about what I've observed, even if that creates risks for my own employment." Also, Kevin's willingness to prioritize integrity over job security reminded me why I'd been optimistic about his potential when he'd first joined TechFlow. His technical skills were impressive, but his ethical standards were what would determine his long-term success as an engineer and innovator. "Kevin, I appreciate your willingness to support accurate information, but I want you to be very careful about any actions that might jeopardize your career. Document everything carefully and maintain copies of your technical work, but don't take unnecessary risks without understanding the potential consequences." I advised Kevin to focus on protecting his own intellectual property rights while avoiding any actions that Morrison might characterize as interference with corporate operations. If broader challenges to TechFlow's patent practices developed, there would be appropriate legal channels for Kevin to provide information without violating his employment obligations. That evening, I reviewed my notes from the conversations with Margaret and Kevin, adding their insights to the timeline I'd been developing. The pattern of Morrison's intellectual property strategy was becoming increasingly clear, and the legal implications were more serious than I'd initially realized. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's consultation tomorrow would help me understand exactly what legal protections I had as an inventor and what obligations TechFlow had to accurately represent my contributions in patent applications. More importantly, I needed to understand whether Morrison's strategy constituted simple employment law issues or potential intellectual property fraud that might warrant intervention by federal authorities. The separation agreement deadline remained Friday, giving me 2 more days to make informed decisions about my response to TechFlow's termination offer. But Margaret's warning about Morrison's planned announcement at the quarterly earnings call created additional urgency around any legal challenges I might want to pursue. As I prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow's meeting with Dr. Walsh would likely determine not just my individual response to TechFlow's separation offer, but whether I would become involved in a broader effort to protect intellectual property rights for inventors throughout the technology industry. Morrison had called me replaceable, but patent law recognized that true innovation was never replaceable, only inadequately protected. The real question was whether I had the legal standing and practical resources to prove that distinction in ways that would matter for both my individual circumstances and the broader principle that innovation deserved appropriate recognition and protection regardless of corporate convenience. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that often accompanies difficult decisions. I woke early, my mind already processing the consultation with Dr. Jennifer Walsh scheduled for that afternoon. The stack of engineering notebooks on my dining table had grown overnight as I'd added documentation from my personal files, creating a comprehensive record of my innovative work at TechFlow that extended far beyond the SmartFlow system. Over breakfast, I methodically reviewed each notebook entry that documented breakthrough moments in my engineering career. The handwritten pages contained not just technical specifications and calculations, but timestamps, environmental conditions, and even emotional states during particularly productive creative sessions. These personal records represented something corporate lawyers couldn't easily challenge: the authentic intellectual journey from initial concept to working innovation. One entry from 18 months ago particularly caught my attention. I'd been struggling with a persistent inefficiency in automated quality control systems when the solution had emerged during a weekend hiking trip in the hill country west of Austin. The breakthrough hadn't occurred in TechFlow's laboratories, using company resources, but during personal time while contemplating the natural feedback loops I observed in ecosystem management. That innovation had eventually become a core component of the SmartFlow system's adaptive learning algorithms, generating significant value for TechFlow while building on insights that were entirely independent of my employment circumstances. The notebook entry included sketches drawn on napkins from a roadside cafe, photographic evidence that the creative development had occurred outside any corporate environment. Federal patent law recognized these distinctions, protecting innovations that built on personal knowledge, individual creativity, or development circumstances that extended beyond standard employment obligations. Morrison's broad claims about corporate ownership of all employee innovations might sound impressive to potential acquirers, but they wouldn't necessarily withstand legal scrutiny from patent attorneys who understood the nuanced requirements of intellectual property attribution. My phone displayed several new messages from colleagues who'd heard about TechFlow's latest restructuring decisions. The consensus among Austin's engineering community was bewilderment at Morrison's systematic elimination of proven talent, particularly senior engineers whose innovations had built the company's reputation for technical excellence. Dr. Amanda Foster had sent a follow-up message with additional information about Morrison's background that Margaret hadn't mentioned. Sarah did some research on David Morrison's previous positions. Every company he's led has been acquired within 2 years of his appointment, typically after significant workforce reductions and intellectual property consolidation. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Amanda's research confirmed the acquisition strategy that Margaret had outlined, but added concerning details about Morrison's track record. His previous companies had experienced significant patent disputes following their sales, with several original inventors successfully challenging the intellectual property transfers that had been central to the acquisition valuations. The most recent case involved Precision Dynamics, where Morrison eliminated 12 senior engineers 6 months before selling to Consolidated Industries. 3 of those engineers later proved that key patents had been misattributed, resulting in a $40 million settlement and regulatory sanctions against both companies. This precedent was exactly what Dr. Walsh would need to assess the legal merits of potential challenges to TechFlow's patent practices. Morrison's pattern of intellectual property consolidation, followed by rapid acquisition, had previously resulted in successful legal challenges from terminated inventors, creating established case law that could support similar claims. I forwarded Amanda's research to my consultation materials for Dr. Walsh, adding it to the growing documentation that suggested Morrison's strategy represented systematic intellectual property manipulation rather than isolated employment decisions. The pattern evidence would be crucial for demonstrating that my termination was part of a broader scheme rather than legitimate corporate restructuring. At 11:30, Kevin sent a carefully worded email to my personal account with updates on TechFlow's internal developments. Sarah, the new confidentiality agreements were distributed this morning with a requirement for signature by close of business Friday. The intellectual property clauses are significantly broader than previous agreements, requiring employees to waive rights to challenge any patent applications or inventor designations. Kevin's message confirmed that Morrison was accelerating his timeline for securing comprehensive intellectual property control. Requiring existing employees to waive patent challenge rights before the quarterly earnings announcement would eliminate most potential internal resistance to his strategy. Several engineers are asking questions about the new terms, particularly the sections that seem to retroactively modify our rights regarding previous innovations. Dr. Thompson from legal counsel appears uncomfortable with the aggressive language, but isn't providing specific guidance about employee options. The fact that TechFlow's internal legal counsel had reservations about the new agreements suggested they might contain provisions that exceeded standard employment law boundaries. Corporate attorneys typically ensured that employment contracts remained within established legal parameters, so Dr. Thompson's apparent discomfort indicated potential problems with enforceability or compliance. I called Dr. Walsh's office to confirm our afternoon appointment, and to request additional time given the complexity of the documentation I'd assembled. Her assistant explained that Dr. Walsh had blocked out 2 hours for our initial consultation, recognizing that employment-related patent disputes typically required comprehensive case development rather than brief legal advice. The law offices of Walsh & Associates occupied a renovated warehouse in Austin's legal district, reflecting the practical approach that had made Jennifer Walsh respected among both inventors and technology companies. The industrial aesthetic and functional workspace suggested focus on results rather than impressive appearances, exactly the kind of legal representation I needed for challenging corporate intellectual property practices. Dr. Walsh greeted me, personally in the reception area, a woman in her mid-40s with the confident demeanor of someone who'd successfully navigated both engineering and legal careers. Her handshake was firm, her assessment direct but not unfriendly, and her immediate focus on the documentation I'd brought suggested she understood the importance of factual foundations for intellectual property disputes. Her office reflected her dual expertise, with patent law references sharing shelf space with engineering textbooks and technical journals. The walls displayed framed patents from various inventors she'd represented, creating a visual reminder that individual innovation deserved protection and recognition regardless of corporate preferences. Ms. Chen, Margaret Rodriguez provided some background about your situation at TechFlow, but I'd like you to walk me through the specific circumstances of your termination and your concerns about patent attribution. Please be as detailed as possible about the technical innovations you developed and the documentation you've maintained. For the next hour, I methodically presented the timeline of my employment at TechFlow, focusing particularly on the SmartFlow system development and the systematic changes that had occurred following Morrison's appointment as CEO. Dr. Walsh took comprehensive notes, occasionally asking precise questions about technical details or legal implications of specific employment circumstances. She paid particular attention to my engineering notebooks, examining the handwritten entries with the practiced eye of someone who understood both the creative process of innovation and the evidentiary requirements for patent disputes. Her technical background enabled her to understand not just the legal significance of my documentation, but the genuine intellectual contributions represented by the recorded breakthrough moments. Sarah, the documentation you've maintained is exactly what patent law requires for establishing inventor credibility. The timestamps, technical details, and creative development process you've recorded would be difficult for any corporate legal team to challenge effectively. Dr. Walsh explained that patent law specifically protected inventors' rights to recognition and attribution, even when innovations were developed as part of employment obligations. While companies typically owned patents filed by employees, the individual inventors retained certain protections against misrepresentation or fraudulent attribution that couldn't be waived through standard employment agreements. The separation agreement TechFlow has presented includes several provisions that appear to exceed legal boundaries for employment termination settlements. Section 12, in particular, attempts to require you to waive federal rights that aren't subject to private contractual modification. Her legal analysis confirmed my concerns about the aggressive language in Morrison's separation offer. The comprehensive intellectual property waivers weren't just ethically problematic. They might not be legally enforceable under federal patent protection statutes that preserved certain inventor rights regardless of employment circumstances. What concerns me most about your situation, Sarah, is the pattern of behavior you've described regarding other senior engineers and patent applications. If David Morrison is systematically misrepresenting inventor contributions to simplify corporate intellectual property claims, that creates potential violations of federal patent fraud statutes. Dr. Walsh's mention of patent fraud elevated the implications beyond employment law disputes into potential criminal violations that could trigger federal investigation and prosecution. Patent fraud cases were handled by specialized federal prosecutors who had significant resources and enforcement authority for addressing systematic intellectual property manipulation. The precedent case involving precision dynamics that your colleague identified is particularly relevant because it established that systematic inventor misrepresentation constitutes fraud, regardless of the corporate motivations behind the misrepresentation. Morrison's previous pattern could provide crucial evidence for demonstrating intentional rather than accidental patent law violations. Dr. Walsh outlined several potential approaches for addressing my circumstances, ranging from individual, patent challenge proceedings to broader federal complaints about systematic intellectual property fraud. The individual approach would focus specifically on protecting my inventor rights for the SmartFlow system patents, while the broader approach would challenge TechFlow's overall patent practices and Morrison's systematic elimination of original inventors. The individual approach has the advantage of being focused and relatively contained, with lower risk of extended litigation or corporate retaliation. However, it doesn't address the broader pattern of behavior that could affect other inventors or the integrity of TechFlow's entire patent portfolio. The broader approach carried greater risks, but also greater potential impact for preventing similar intellectual property manipulation throughout the technology industry. Federal patent fraud investigations could result in significant penalties for TechFlow and enhanced scrutiny of Morrison's practices at future companies. Sarah, before we discuss specific legal strategies, I need you to understand the potential consequences of challenging TechFlow's patent practices. Morrison and the company will likely respond with aggressive legal tactics designed to discourage your claims and protect their acquisition timeline. Dr. Walsh explained that corporate defendants in patent disputes typically employed intimidation strategies including countersuits, discovery demands, and public relations campaigns designed to portray inventor challenges as disgruntled employee complaints rather than legitimate intellectual property concerns. However, you have several advantages that many inventors lack in these situations. Your technical credentials are impeccable, your documentation is comprehensive, and the pattern evidence regarding Morrison's previous companies provides strong support for claims of systematic rather than isolated problems. She also noted that patent fraud cases often attracted support from inventor advocacy organizations and legal groups focused on protecting individual intellectual property rights. Such support could provide additional resources and expertise for challenging well-funded corporate defendants. The timing of Morrison's planned quarterly earnings announcement creates both opportunity and urgency for any legal action you might want to pursue. If he makes public statements about TechFlow's patent portfolio that misrepresent your contributions, those statements could provide additional evidence of fraudulent intent. Dr. Walsh suggested that the optimal strategy might involve initiating formal patent challenge proceedings before Morrison's earnings announcement, ensuring that any public statements he made would be subject to pending legal scrutiny. This approach could prevent him from making irreversible claims about intellectual property ownership while preserving all legal options for broader challenges. I recommend that we file preliminary patent challenge documents with the Patent Office tomorrow, establishing your legal standing as the documented inventor of the SmartFlow technologies before Morrison can make public statements that might complicate the attribution process. The urgency Dr. Walsh described aligned with my growing understanding that Morrison's 3-week timeline for the earnings announcement wasn't arbitrary. He needed to present TechFlow's intellectual property portfolio as cleanly owned corporate assets before potential acquirers conducted detailed due diligence that might reveal complications around inventor attribution. What kind of authority does the Patent Office have to investigate potential fraud in patent applications? Dr. Walsh's expression grew more serious as she explained the federal enforcement mechanisms available for addressing patent fraud. Patent examiners have broad investigative authority when they receive credible allegations of false or misleading information in patent applications. They can demand comprehensive documentation, interview all parties involved in innovation development, and refer cases to federal prosecutors when evidence suggests criminal violations. She outlined several recent cases where patent office investigations had resulted in significant consequences for companies that had systematically misrepresented inventor contributions. The penalties included patent invalidation, financial sanctions, enhanced scrutiny of future applications, and in the most serious cases, criminal prosecution of corporate executives who had knowingly participated in fraudulent schemes. The leverage you have, Sarah, extends beyond your individual inventor rights. Patent fraud undermines the entire intellectual property system that enables innovation and technological development. Federal authorities take these violations seriously because they threaten the legal foundations that protect all inventors. Dr. Walsh's perspective helped me understand that challenging Morrison's strategy wasn't just about personal vindication or financial compensation. It was about protecting the intellectual property system that enabled innovation by ensuring that inventors received appropriate recognition and attribution for their creative contributions. If you decide to proceed with formal legal action, I'll need you to prepare comprehensive sworn statements documenting your role in developing the SmartFlow technologies and any observations you've made about TechFlow's patent practices under Morrison's leadership. She also requested permission to contact Kevin Park and other current TechFlow employees who might have relevant information about recent patent filing procedures and intellectual property policy changes. Such contact would need to be carefully managed to avoid creating employment complications for cooperative witnesses. The engineering notebooks you've maintained will be crucial evidence, but will also need to demonstrate the broader pattern of Morrison's intellectual property consolidation strategy. The information Margaret Rodriguez and Amanda Foster provided will help establish the systematic nature of the problems you've identified. Dr. Walsh concluded our consultation by outlining the immediate steps necessary for protecting my legal interests while preserving all options for broader challenges to TechFlow's patent practices. The priority was filing preliminary challenge documents before Morrison's earnings announcement, ensuring that any public statements he made would be subject to established legal scrutiny. Sarah, I want you to understand that pursuing these challenges will likely be demanding and potentially expensive, even though patent fraud cases often attract contingency representation and organizational support. You'll be challenging a corporation with significant legal resources and a CEO who has experience managing similar disputes. Her candid assessment of the challenges helped me understand the full scope of what I would be undertaking. This wasn't just about refusing to sign Morrison's separation agreement. It was about taking on a systematic pattern of intellectual property manipulation that extended across multiple companies and potentially affected numerous inventors. However, you have better documentation, stronger technical credentials, and more compelling pattern evidence than most inventors who challenge corporate patent practices. If you decide to proceed, we have excellent prospects for both protecting your individual rights and addressing the broader problems you've identified. As our consultation concluded, Dr. Walsh provided specific guidance about immediate actions I could take to strengthen my legal position. She recommended against signing any version of TechFlow's separation agreement without significant modifications that preserved my patent challenge rights and eliminated the problematic intellectual property waivers. If Morrison's deadline pressure increases, remember that you have no legal obligation to accept his terms or timeline. Employment termination settlements are negotiations, not ultimatums, regardless of how corporate legal departments might present them. Dr. Walsh also suggested that I begin documenting any additional information about TechFlow's patent practices that might emerge through continuing contact with current employees like Kevin Park. Such documentation could prove crucial if broader, federal investigations developed from individual patent challenges. The most important thing to remember, Sarah, is that patent law specifically protects inventors against exactly the kind of systematic attribution manipulation you've described. Morrison's strategy might sound impressive to potential acquirers, but it relies on legal claims that probably won't withstand careful scrutiny from patent attorneys or federal investigators. I left Dr. Walsh's office with a comprehensive understanding of my legal options and a clear timeline for making decisions about how to respond to Morrison's separation offer and broader intellectual property strategy. The consultation had transformed my understanding of the situation from personal employment dispute to potential federal patent fraud case with implications extending far beyond my individual circumstances. The drive back to my apartment provided time to process the legal framework Dr. Walsh had outlined and consider the broader implications of challenging TechFlow's patent practices. Morrison had dismissed me as replaceable, but patent law recognized that genuine innovation was never replaceable, only inadequately protected or improperly attributed. The real question was whether I had the courage and resources to prove that distinction in ways that would matter, not just for my own circumstances, but for the broader principle that innovation deserved recognition and protection regardless of corporate convenience or acquisition strategies. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Robert Kim at the Patent Office's Regional Examination Division. Margaret Rodriguez had contacted him about potential concerns regarding recent patent filing irregularities from Austin-area technology companies, and he was interested in discussing any information I might have about systematic attribution problems. Ms. Chen, we've been monitoring some unusual patterns in patent applications from certain technology companies where inventor designations seem inconsistent with the documented development histories. Your name came up as someone who might have insights about these practices. Dr. Kim's call suggested that federal authorities were already aware of potential problems with corporate patent practices in Austin's technology sector. Morrison's strategy might not be as novel or legally secure as he'd assumed, particularly if patent office examiners were actively investigating similar cases involving systematic inventor misrepresentation. I'd be interested in meeting with you to discuss any observations you've made about patent filing procedures at TechFlow Industries. Such information could be valuable for ensuring the accuracy and integrity of intellectual property applications we're currently reviewing. The timing of Dr. Kim's call, combined with Dr. Walsh's legal analysis, suggested that the federal enforcement mechanisms for protecting patent integrity were more active and effective than Morrison had probably calculated. His strategy of systematic inventor elimination might have worked at smaller companies with limited technical expertise, but TechFlow's innovations were significant enough to attract federal attention. As I prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would likely determine not just my individual response to Morrison's termination offer, but whether I would become involved in a broader federal effort to protect intellectual property rights throughout the technology industry. The consultation with Dr. Walsh had provided the legal framework for challenging Morrison's strategy, and Dr. Kim's call suggested that federal authorities were already investigating similar problems. Morrison had called me replaceable during our termination meeting, but the legal and regulatory framework surrounding patent protection recognized that true innovation was never replaceable. The challenge was demonstrating that distinction through appropriate legal channels before Morrison could complete his systematic appropriation of TechFlow's intellectual property assets. The separation agreement deadline remained tomorrow afternoon, giving me less than 24 hours to make final decisions about how to respond to Morrison's offer. But the legal consultation and federal contact had provided crucial perspective about the broader implications of my choices. This wasn't just about personal vindication anymore. It was about protecting the intellectual property system that enabled technological innovation and ensured appropriate recognition for creative contributions. Friday would bring difficult decisions with significant consequences, but tonight had brought something equally important: comprehensive understanding of the legal protections available for inventors and the federal mechanisms designed to prevent exactly the kind of systematic patent manipulation that Morrison appeared to be implementing. Patent law wasn't just about protecting individual inventors. It was about maintaining the integrity of the innovation process that drove technological advancement. Morrison's dismissal of my expertise as outdated had been professionally insulting, but his systematic appropriation of my innovations represented something far more serious. potential federal crimes that could result in significant legal consequences, regardless of his corporate authority or acquisition timeline. The question was whether I had the determination to pursue those protections through appropriate legal channels, knowing that such action would transform my termination from corporate employment decision into federal intellectual property investigation. Friday morning arrived with the weight of finality. The separation agreement deadline loomed at 5 o'clock, but more importantly, Dr. Walsh had scheduled our meeting with Dr. Robert Kim from the Patent Office for 10:30. The federal investigation that had seemed like a distant possibility just days ago was now becoming a concrete reality, with my documentation serving as potential evidence in a case that could reshape how technology companies handled intellectual property attribution. I dressed carefully for what I knew would be one of the most important meetings of my professional life. The navy blazer I selected was the same one I'd worn to countless product presentations at TechFlow, but today it felt like armor for a battle that extended far beyond my individual circumstances. The engineering notebooks I'd organized the night before sat in a leather portfolio, 12 years of innovation history that could prove the difference between corporate intellectual property fraud and legitimate business practices. The drive to Dr. Walsh's office gave me time to review the timeline that had brought me to this moment. 4 days ago, I'd been a senior research engineer with a stable career and promising stock options. Now I was potentially the key witness in a federal patent fraud investigation that could affect one of Austin's most prominent technology companies. The transformation felt surreal, but the legal framework Dr. Walsh had explained made the progression seem almost inevitable. Morrison's strategy of systematic inventor elimination had worked at his previous companies because the terminated engineers hadn't understood their legal protections or hadn't possessed sufficient documentation to challenge corporate patent claims. But federal intellectual property law had evolved specifically to prevent the kind of systematic misappropriation that Morrison appeared to be implementing, and patent office enforcement mechanisms had become increasingly sophisticated at identifying fraudulent attribution patterns. Dr. Walsh met me in her office reception area with Dr. Kim, a soft-spoken man in his 50s whose calm demeanor masked what I would soon discover was an encyclopedic knowledge of patent law and a passionate commitment to protecting intellectual property integrity. His introduction was brief but telling. He'd been investigating irregularities in Austin area patent filings for the past 6 months, following tips from multiple sources about systematic attribution problems at several technology companies. Ms. Chen, I appreciate your willingness to discuss your observations about patent practices at TechFlow Industries. We've been reviewing some unusual patterns in recent applications from companies where new leadership has been appointed, and your situation appears to fit concerning trends we've identified. Dr. Kim's careful language indicated that TechFlow wasn't the only company under scrutiny, but rather part of a broader pattern of intellectual property manipulation that had attracted federal attention. Morrison's strategy might have seemed innovative to corporate executives focused on acquisition preparation, but it represented well-established fraudulent practices that patent authorities had seen repeatedly. The meeting began with Dr. Kim requesting a comprehensive overview of my employment history at TechFlow, focusing particularly on my role in developing the SmartFlow system and the circumstances surrounding recent patent filing procedures. I provided a detailed timeline, supported by documentation from my engineering notebooks and correspondence with colleagues like Kevin Park, who could corroborate technical development details. Dr. Kim examined my handwritten research notes with the practiced attention of someone who understood both the creative process of innovation and the evidentiary requirements for patent fraud investigations. He paid particular attention to entries that documented breakthrough moments occurring outside TechFlow's facilities, recognizing that innovations developed using personal time and resources created complex attribution questions that corporate lawyers often oversimplified. The documentation you've maintained is exceptionally thorough, Ms. Chen. Patent fraud investigations often struggle with establishing the actual development timeline and individual contributions to complex innovations. Your notebooks provide exactly the kind of contemporaneous evidence that allows us to verify whether corporate patent claims accurately represent the true innovation history. Dr. Kim explained that patent fraud cases typically involved systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents, which was why the information about Morrison's previous companies was particularly valuable. The pattern evidence helped distinguish between aggressive but legal corporate intellectual property strategies and fraudulent schemes designed to misrepresent inventor contributions for financial gain. We've been investigating David Morrison's patent practices at his previous positions, and the similarities to current developments at TechFlow are striking. The systematic removal of original inventors followed by rapid patent filing acceleration appears to be a consistent strategy rather than coincidental corporate restructuring. This federal perspective provided crucial context for understanding why Morrison's actions had felt so calculated and predetermined. He wasn't making isolated decisions about cost reduction or organizational efficiency. He was implementing a refined strategy that he'd successfully employed at multiple companies to manipulate intellectual property ownership in preparation for corporate sales. Dr. Kim requested permission to interview Kevin Park and other current TechFlow employees who might have relevant information about recent changes to patent filing procedures and intellectual property policies. Such interviews would need to be conducted carefully to avoid creating employment complications for cooperative witnesses, but they could provide crucial corroboration for the systematic nature of the problems I'd identified. Federal patent. Fraud investigations require demonstrating intentional misrepresentation rather than mere corporate overzealousness about intellectual property claims. The pattern evidence across multiple companies helps establish that Morrison's actions represent deliberate fraud rather than enthusiastic but legal corporate advocacy. Dr. Walsh interjected with legal perspective about the specific protections available for inventors in my situation. Sarah's case is particularly strong because her innovations were developed using a combination of company resources and personal research that occurred outside standard employment obligations. Federal law specifically protects inventors against corporate attempts to claim comprehensive ownership of innovations that build on individual knowledge and creativity. The legal framework Dr. Walsh described aligned perfectly with Dr. Y. Kim's enforcement priorities. Patent law wasn't just about protecting individual inventors, it was about maintaining the integrity of the innovation system that encouraged technological development by ensuring appropriate recognition and attribution for creative contributions. Ms. Chen, based on the documentation you've provided and the pattern evidence we've gathered about Morrison's practices, I believe we have sufficient grounds to initiate a formal patent fraud investigation regarding TechFlow's recent applications. This investigation would examine whether the company's claims about inventor contributions and development circumstances accurately represent the actual innovation history. Dr. Kim's announcement transformed my situation from potential individual legal action to active federal investigation with significant enforcement authority. Patent fraud investigations could result in patent invalidation, financial penalties, enhanced scrutiny of future applications, and in cases involving systematic fraud, criminal prosecution of responsible executives. The investigation process typically takes 60 to 90 days for initial findings, but we can issue immediate notifications to TechFlow requiring them to suspend any patent applications that might be affected by the fraud allegations. This would prevent Morrison from completing his intellectual property consolidation strategy while the investigation proceeds. The timing implications were significant for Morrison's acquisition planning. If TechFlow couldn't complete patent transfers or make claims about clean intellectual property ownership, potential acquirers like Meridian Technologies would likely delay or restructure their offers pending resolution of the federal investigation. Dr. Kim also explained that patent fraud investigations often expanded beyond the initial companies involved when systematic patterns emerged. Morrison's strategy at previous companies would be subject to renewed scrutiny, potentially affecting the intellectual property portfolios of multiple corporations and creating industry-wide awareness of the legal risks associated with systematic inventor misrepresentation. One of the most important aspects of this investigation, Ms. Chen, is that it protects not just your individual inventor rights, but establishes precedent that helps prevent similar intellectual property fraud throughout the technology industry. Corporate executives need to understand that systematic inventor elimination carries serious federal legal consequences. Dr. Walsh added that the federal investigation would provide legal protection for my patent challenge rights that no corporate separation agreement could eliminate. Even if Morrison attempts to pressure you into signing the separation agreement, your status as a witness in a federal investigation creates legal protections that supersede any employment settlement terms. This protection was exactly what I needed to resist Morrison's deadline pressure while maintaining all legal options for addressing both my individual circumstances and the broader patent fraud issues. The federal investigation transformed the separation agreement from urgent deadline into irrelevant corporate posturing that couldn't affect my legal standing or inventor rights. Dr. Kim, what kind of cooperation would you need from me during the investigation process? Initially, we'll need comprehensive sworn statements documenting your role in developing the technologies in question and your observations about TechFlow's patent practices under Morrison's leadership. We'll also need access to all relevant documentation, including your engineering notebooks and any correspondence with colleagues about technical development processes. Dr. Kim explained that patent fraud investigations often attracted support from inventor advocacy organizations and professional engineering societies that had institutional interests in protecting intellectual property integrity. Such support could provide additional expertise and resources for challenging corporate defendants with significant legal capabilities. The investigation will also examine Morrison's public statements about TechFlow's intellectual property portfolio, particularly any claims he makes during the quarterly earnings announcement. If he misrepresents inventor contributions or development circumstances in public financial communications, that could provide additional evidence of fraudulent intent. The mention of Morrison's planned earnings announcement reminded me that he was probably preparing to present TechFlow's patents as cleanly owned corporate assets without acknowledging individual inventor contributions or potential attribution complications. Such public misrepresentation could significantly strengthen the federal fraud case while exposing Morrison to additional securities law violations. Dr. Walsh and Dr. Kim spent the next hour outlining the specific procedures for initiating the formal investigation and the timeline for various legal actions that would protect my inventor rights while addressing the broader fraud allegations. The process was more comprehensive and faster-moving than I'd expected, reflecting the serious priority that federal authorities placed on intellectual property protection. Sarah, I want you to understand that participating in this investigation will likely result in significant corporate retaliation from Morrison and TechFlow's legal team. They'll probably characterize your cooperation as disgruntled employee behavior rather than legitimate intellectual property protection, and they'll use aggressive legal tactics designed to discourage your participation. Dr. Kim's warning was sobering, but not unexpected. Corporate defendants in patent fraud cases typically employed intimidation strategies, including countersuits, discovery demands, and public relations campaigns designed to discredit inventor challenges and protect acquisition timelines. However, your participation in a federal investigation provides legal protections against corporate retaliation that extend far beyond standard employment law safeguards. Companies that attempt to intimidate federal witnesses face additional criminal charges that most corporate legal departments work very hard to avoid. The legal protections Dr. Kim described gave me confidence that challenging Morrison's intellectual property strategy wouldn't result in the kind of career destruction that had probably silenced inventors at his previous companies. Federal witness protection statutes were specifically designed to prevent corporate intimidation of individuals who cooperated with legitimate law enforcement investigations. As our meeting concluded, Dr. Kim requested that I avoid any communication with TechFlow regarding my decision about the separation agreement until the federal investigation procedures were formally initiated. We'll be contacting TechFlow's legal department this afternoon to notify them about the investigation and to request suspension of any patent applications that might be affected by the fraud allegations. The timing meant that Morrison would learn about the federal investigation before my separation agreement deadline, potentially eliminating his leverage for pressuring me into signing the problematic intellectual property waivers. More importantly, the investigation would prevent him from making public statements about TechFlow's patent portfolio until the fraud allegations were resolved. Dr. Walsh concluded by emphasizing that the federal investigation represented the optimal outcome for both protecting my individual inventor rights and addressing the systematic problems that could affect numerous other engineers and innovators. This isn't just about your personal situation anymore, Sarah. It's about establishing legal precedent that protects intellectual property integrity throughout the technology industry. I left the meeting with a profound sense of resolution and purpose. The decision to challenge Morrison's intellectual property strategy had evolved from personal grievance into federal investigation, with potentially industry-wide implications. Patent law wasn't just about protecting individual inventors. It was about maintaining the legal framework that enabled innovation by ensuring appropriate recognition and attribution for creative contributions. The drive back to my apartment provided time to process the transformation of my circumstances from terminated employee to federal witness in a significant intellectual property fraud investigation. Morrison had dismissed me as replaceable, but federal law recognized that genuine innovation was never replaceable, only inadequately protected or fraudulently misrepresented. That afternoon, I received a call from Lisa Thompson at TechFlow's HR department. Her tone was markedly different from the confident professionalism she'd displayed during my termination meeting, replaced by careful uncertainty that suggested she'd been briefed about federal developments. Sarah, we've received some inquiries from federal authorities about patent procedures, and we wanted to check on your status regarding the separation agreement. If you have any questions about the terms or need additional time for consideration, we're open to discussing modifications. Lisa's sudden flexibility represented a complete reversal from Morrison's previous deadline pressure, confirming that the federal investigation had immediately altered TechFlow's legal strategy. The company could no longer afford to alienate potential federal witnesses through aggressive employment settlement tactics. Lisa, I'll need to decline the separation agreement as currently structured. The intellectual property provisions are inconsistent with my legal obligations as an inventor and potential federal witness. My response was carefully worded to indicate awareness of federal protections without explicitly discussing the investigation details. Lisa's extended silence suggested she understood the implications of my reference to federal witness status and legal obligations that superseded corporate employment agreements. I see. Let me discuss this with our legal department and see what alternative arrangements might be possible. We certainly want to resolve your employment transition in a way that's fair to everyone involved. The corporate retreat was exactly what Dr. Walsh had predicted. Companies facing potential federal investigations typically abandoned aggressive legal tactics in favor of damage control strategies designed to minimize regulatory scrutiny and avoid additional criminal liability. 2 hours later, Kevin Park called with urgent information about developments at TechFlow. Sarah, something major is happening. Morrison called an emergency executive meeting this afternoon, and afterwards he canceled the quarterly earnings announcement scheduled for next week. The official explanation is that recent organizational changes require additional financial review, but everyone knows something significant has changed. Kevin's report confirmed that the federal investigation had immediately disrupted Morrison's acquisition timeline and intellectual property strategy. Canceling the earnings announcement eliminated his opportunity to make public claims about TechFlow's patent portfolio, while federal fraud allegations were pending investigation. There's more. The new confidentiality agreements were suddenly withdrawn with no explanation, and several engineers who had already signed them were told the documents would be returned and shouldn't be discussed. Dr. Thompson from legal counsel looked like she'd seen a ghost when she made the announcement. The systematic reversal of Morrison's intellectual property consolidation strategy demonstrated how quickly federal intervention could neutralize corporate fraud schemes. Patent Office investigations carried enforcement authority that most corporate legal departments couldn't effectively challenge or circumvent. Kevin, I want you to be very careful about how you respond to any questions about recent events. Document everything carefully, but don't take unnecessary risks without understanding the full legal implications. Kevin's situation represented exactly why federal patent fraud investigations were necessary. Individual employees typically lacked the legal resources and job security to challenge systematic intellectual property manipulation, but federal enforcement mechanisms could protect entire workforces from fraudulent corporate practices. That evening, Margaret Rodriguez called with updates from her contacts on TechFlow's board of directors. Sarah, the board held an emergency session this afternoon after receiving notification about federal patent investigations. Morrison's authority regarding intellectual property decisions has been suspended pending resolution of the federal review. Margaret's information confirmed that the Patent Office investigation had triggered immediate corporate governance intervention. Board members who might have tolerated aggressive intellectual property strategies under normal circumstances couldn't ignore federal fraud allegations that threatened the company's legal standing and acquisition prospects. The board has also authorized independent legal counsel to review all patent applications filed during Morrison's tenure to ensure compliance with federal attribution requirements. They're taking this very seriously because patent fraud violations could invalidate TechFlow's entire intellectual property portfolio. The independent legal review represented exactly the kind of comprehensive assessment that Morrison had been trying to avoid through his systematic elimination of original inventors. Federal investigation pressure had forced TechFlow to implement the transparent evaluation processes that proper corporate governance should have required from the beginning. As Friday evening approached, I reflected on the remarkable transformation of my circumstances over the past week. 7 days ago, I'd been a senior research engineer with a stable career and promising stock options. Now, I was a federal witness in a patent fraud investigation that could reshape intellectual property practices throughout the technology industry. Morrison's dismissal of my expertise as outdated had been personally insulting, but his systematic appropriation of my innovations had represented something far more serious. Federal crimes that carried significant legal consequences, regardless of corporate authority or acquisition strategies. The Patent Office investigation had demonstrated that intellectual property law provided robust protections for inventors against exactly the kind of systematic fraud that Morrison had been implementing. The separation agreement deadline passed, without response from TechFlow, rendered irrelevant by federal protections that superseded any corporate employment settlement terms. Morrison's leverage had evaporated the moment Patent Office investigators began examining his intellectual property practices with the authority to impose criminal penalties for fraudulent attribution. Over the weekend, I received a call from Dr. Amanda Foster with news from Austin's broader technology community. Sarah, word about the TechFlow patent investigation is spreading through the engineering networks. Several other inventors are coming forward with similar concerns about systematic attribution problems at companies where Morrison and his associates have worked. Amanda's report suggested that the federal investigation was having the industry-wide impact that Dr. Kim had described. Patent fraud cases often attracted additional victims who had been afraid to challenge corporate practices individually, but were willing to cooperate with federal investigations that provided legal protection and enforcement authority. The consensus among senior engineers is that this investigation could establish crucial precedent for protecting inventor rights throughout the technology sector. Morrison's strategy worked at smaller companies because individual inventors didn't have the resources or knowledge to challenge systematic intellectual property manipulation. The broader implications extended far beyond my individual circumstances or even TechFlow's corporate practices. Federal enforcement of patent attribution requirements would send a clear message to technology companies that systematic inventor elimination carried serious legal risks that could outweigh any short-term acquisition benefits. Monday morning brought confirmation that the federal investigation was proceeding rapidly. Dr. Kim called to inform me that TechFlow had agreed to cooperate fully with the Patent Office review and had suspended all patent applications pending completion of the investigation. Morrison's intellectual property consolidation strategy had been completely halted by federal intervention. We've also received voluntary cooperation from several other inventors who worked at Morrison's previous companies. The pattern evidence is becoming overwhelming, and we expect to complete our initial findings within 30 days, rather than the typical 60 to 90-day timeline. The accelerated investigation schedule suggested that federal authorities had found compelling evidence of systematic fraud that warranted urgent intervention. Patent Office investigators typically moved slowly and deliberately, so the rapid progression indicated serious violations that required immediate enforcement action. 3 weeks later, the Patent Office released its preliminary findings in what would become known as the Morrison Patent Fraud Investigation. The report documented systematic misrepresentation of inventor contributions across 4 companies where Morrison had served in executive positions, affecting 37 patents, with combined estimated value exceeding $200 million. TechFlow was required to correct all patent applications that had been affected by the fraudulent attribution practices, with my name restored as primary inventor for the SmartFlow system technologies. More importantly, Morrison was banned from serving in executive positions at any company involved in patent development, and criminal charges were filed for systematic intellectual property fraud. The investigation results sent shockwaves through Austin's technology community and the broader corporate world. The case established federal precedent that systematic inventor elimination constituted criminal fraud, regardless of corporate justifications. About cost reduction or acquisition preparation, Meridian Technologies withdrew their acquisition offer for TechFlow, citing concerns about intellectual property integrity and federal regulatory scrutiny. The collapsed acquisition ultimately saved TechFlow from corporate dismantling while forcing genuine reassessment of leadership priorities and innovation protection practices. 6 months after my termination, TechFlow's board of directors offered me the position of Chief Innovation Officer with explicit authority to ensure proper intellectual property attribution and inventor protection throughout the company's research and development operations. The role represented complete vindication of the methodical, integrity-focused approach that Morrison had dismissed as outdated. The SmartFlow system launched successfully 18 months later, generating over $60 million in first year revenue while receiving industry recognition for its innovative approach to sustainable manufacturing automation. My inventor status was prominently featured in all marketing materials and patent documentation, establishing precedent for appropriate attribution that other technology companies began adopting voluntarily. The Morrison case became required study material in engineering ethics courses and corporate law programs, demonstrating how federal intellectual property protections could effectively counter systematic inventor elimination when individual victims had sufficient documentation and legal support. The case also established inventor advocacy networks that helped other engineers protect their intellectual property rights against corporate manipulation. Morrison's dismissal of my expertise as replaceable had revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of innovation value and legal requirements. Patent law recognized that genuine creativity was never replaceable, only inadequately protected or fraudulently misrepresented. The federal investigation had proven that distinction through enforcement mechanisms that transformed corporate intellectual property practices industry-wide. The experience taught me that individual integrity and systematic documentation could successfully challenge even well-funded corporate fraud schemes when supported by appropriate legal frameworks and federal enforcement authority. Being called outdated by someone who prioritized extraction over innovation wasn't an insult. It was evidence of fundamental confusion about what made technology valuable and trustworthy. Sometimes the most important expertise isn't the newest methodology, but the comprehensive understanding that connects isolated innovations into meaningful systems while ensuring appropriate recognition for creative contributions. Morrison's strategy of systematic inventor elimination had failed because it misunderstood both the legal requirements for intellectual property protection and the fundamental principle that sustainable innovation requires trust, integrity, and respect for individual creativity. The federal investigation had established that these principles weren't outdated values to be discarded for corporate convenience, but essential foundations for maintaining the intellectual property system that enabled technological advancement. Patent fraud wasn't just harmful to individual inventors. It threatened the legal framework that encouraged innovation by ensuring appropriate recognition and protection for creative contributions. In the end, Morrison's attempt to call me replaceable had revealed something far more important: that integrity, documentation, and principled resistance to systematic fraud were never replaceable, regardless of corporate authority or acquisition timelines. The federal investigation had proven that truth through legal mechanisms designed specifically to protect innovation against exactly the kind of systematic manipulation that Morrison had been implementing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.